Okay, hello. I'm a little early, and hopefully things are working from the technical side. So, welcome. I presume Evan is going to come on now in a minute or two, um, as it's a little early. So, I had a chat last night with Hall and Philip from Irish Medieval History and Clans and Dynasties, which went well. A lot of people watched it. And we'll be doing one next week with the two guys. And I will be having a video coming out on Saturday afternoon about the famine. It may be a bit controversial because the famine is something very complex. I'm going to come back to that in a couple of questions, but it's a complex topic, and some people want to hear something simple. Um, Hi, Kira. Nice to see you there. I think you're the first on tonight. Hope you're well. And I wonder, is the weather in Mayo as overcast and foggy and damp as it is here in Kerry? It's not the nicest of days. I just drove back. My daughter's school was having a parent teacher meeting, which I wasn't expecting, which is why I'm starting at 8 tonight. Um, so, as I was saying, so I'll have a video out on Saturday, and then I'll do another of these videos hopefully next Tuesday, and then Wednesday will be the live streaming. Yeah, wet, damp, wet. Exactly, exactly. Well, it is November. It is November. The my least favorite month in Ireland. It's a long month. It's wet. It's dark. There's no bank holidays. At least once we get to December, Christmas is coming, and then the days start to get longer and it starts to get nicer. But for now, just rain. Just rain. Okay, I'll start with the first question. Do you think Irish Druids existed? Yeah, it's mild. It's not too cold. Mind you, there's a few people with fires around here. I see the bit of smoke going up. I see the bit of smoke going up. It's damp but warm. Like I think it's 12, 13 degrees here, so there's no bite in the air, but I'm sure that'll come. And then in Ireland, when it's damp, it just feels so much colder. It feels so much colder. Okay, on to the first question. Do you think druids existed in Ireland? I've probably discussed this before. It's one of these questions which has many nuances. All history um you have to go into nuances. History is never black and white. If it's black and white, it's simplistic and probably wrong. Um the problem with the word druid is, hi Dennis, hope you're well. Hope you're not too damp in Cork, but I've a feeling since it's damp up in Mayo, it's damp in Kerry. I'm fairly sure down in Kinsale is not the best. So Druids, the word comes to us through a series of concepts, through a series of lenses. Um, the sun, the good old sun. I remember the sun. So Druid, most people, their concept of Druid is a Roman one, or at least it's seen through a Roman perspective. What the Romans wrote about Druids. Hi Jesse, nice to see you here for a change. Hope you're well. I hope it's a bit less damp wherever you are in England or Wales at the moment. So the Roman writers on the Druids were very successful. Almost all writing on Druids nowadays involves that concept, which is essentially someone in white robes, perhaps with a sickle. He plays, should we say, a political, religious, mystical slash magical role. Um, and then reading more Roman history. So you had these druids in Gaul, and there are differences in what they do depending on the author. Like Caesar is anti-Druids, but there are other Roman authors who put them as more moderate figures. Then the Druids, there seem to be Druids in Britain, and Tacitus's work on Agricola mainly about the Roman conquest, the Roman victories in the north of England. He has, hi Cat, hope you're well. Um, he has this paints this picture of the Isle of Anglesey, where Holyhead is now, of it being captured and the Druids being wiped out there. And he portrays a very vivid picture of the Romans being almost prevented from landing out of fear of the Druids. And I think there's one episode where it's there's the Romans are on boats and these women appear on the shore and they're screaming and the soldiers are afraid. Except you always have to look at analyze these Roman texts with a great deal of skepticism. Um, Tacitus is a very interesting writer. He has some very good ideas. As a historian, he's a bit more complicated. He's trying to. Oh, hi, Miho. Yeah, I think we share a lot of the regulars. So Tacitus, he's trying to portray a Roman decadence, and he's trying to portray a certain type of barbarism, which is good and bad in many ways. It's the barbarians of Tacitus are harder in a way, more masculine in a funny way than the than the decadent Romans, but it's still the Romans who win. Um, so he bigs up the idea of this network of druids, of as these druids being being people who are very, very important. Um, that type of druid did exist in Gaul and it seems to have existed in Britain. What sort of religious figure existed in Ireland? Um, I'm not sure if there were druids. I'm sure there were people who filled the role that druids did. It's just I don't like the word because it comes with too many Roman concepts attached to it. Um, Religion in pre-Christian religion in Ireland, to me, seems to be something very decentralized. There wasn't a pagan church. There wasn't a strict pantheon of gods. Like again, Roman writers, they love to equate local gods with their gods and say this is the Gaulish Jupiter, this is the British Mercury, etc. It's not always possible to do that. And we don't have Roman writers writing about Ireland with that much detail. Most of these Roman writers are writing from outside. There is a lot of contact between Rome and Ireland. There's a lot of trade. Um, but and a lot of stories came and went. But there wasn't that much. These writers, the Roman intellectuals who produce a lot of the texts, very few of them, if any, would have set foot in Ireland. And then, if you jump ahead a few centuries, Ireland becomes Christianized and starts producing texts. That's when the word Druid starts appearing, but it appears already containing this idea of a Druid being the Roman type Druid. And then there's some reference to them in the early texts. Reading Patrick, through the lines, you can come across some sort of stuff. But most of the stuff about Druids, especially about fights between Patrick and Druids, comes about 2 centuries later or more. And it fits into this portrayal of Patrick fighting a pagan church, so the same as other Christian martyrs, etc. So Patrick wasn't martyred, so they draw on the Roman idea of Druid and make it worse as someone being opposed. It's an ahistoric thing. Yet at the same time, undoubtedly, with certainty, there was religion here. It was a very, as I said, decentralized religion. There were people who were some sort of clerics. They could have been men, they could have been women, they could have been both, and it's probably both. But we don't know with certainty. I know that some people claim that the word druid has an Indo-European origin. But again, it's a question that I think needs a lot of dealing with, a lot of fleshing out. Because we have some very interesting knowledge about pre-Christian beliefs, like the Crumb seems undoubtedly to have been a god. A lot of what's written about him is bad, but for example, that the parents sacrificed their firstborn, etc. But in a way, a lot of that is just repeating what was written about the Carthaginians who are accused of sacrificing children and may have, I think the balance of the evidence that they did, it's rehashing, say, stuff that you find in the Bible attacking the god Baal, who I think was Babylonian. So Crumb existed, but I don't think he was a bloodthirsty god the way he was portrayed. Anu seems to definitely have been a female god. You have Pabst Anu in outside Killarney, the breasts of Anu. You have a lot of sacred mountains around Ireland, many of which have cairns on top. These cairns are very hard to date. Some of them, especially in the Dublin and Wicklow Mountains, have passage graves on the top of them. So there's a lot of evidence there. Passage graves were built, though most passage graves are pre-Gaelic. They date back to the Neolithic. You also have stone circles. So there's a lot of evidence for ritual, for religion. Can we call these people druids? I say yes and no. Yes, because it's a concept that has a lot of good in it. We just have to be very careful about using it. Is Conan the Barbarian a reliable source regarding Crumb? I don't think so, but I'm not up with reading about Conan the Barbarian. I know there was films, but I think he did. Yeah, I think he drew in it, but I don't think it's a good source. I don't think it's a good source at all. There's not many good sources. It's more the word comes up and you have to scratch through stuff. The same as in Ireland, there's so many holy wells. I'm convinced a lot of them were pre-Christian, and the same again with the royal sites, Tara, Rathcrogan in Connacht, Awan in Ulster, Dunallen in Leinster, Cashel in Tipperary. All of these go way. I'm not sure about Cashel, but all the others go back to the Neolithic. They're pre-Gaelic. They're pre-Iron Age. Yet they were very important. They remain very important places. Like Tara, the amount of mythology about Tara, most of which you could say is about female gods related to sovereignty. And Tara was a ceremonial landscape that changed, got bigger. Tara is central to Gaelic Irish identities in many ways because of the idea of the kingship of Ireland, but also because of the idea of sovereignty. So I'm sure that if you wanted to talk about Druids, if you wanted to reconstruct, to get a better idea of Irish Druids, you have to dive deeply into Tara itself. Mihal, in the town isn't Feldham called a Banfloor prophetess. Yeah, like the Irish, the Irish, the old Irish texts, whether it's the ones Fionn McHugh, whether it's the Cuchulainn and the Ulster cycle or the King cycle, you'll find a lot of references to prophetess, to magicians, a lot, and to a lot of women. Maeve, like Maeve, there's a Maeve connected with Tara who may or may not be the same Maeve who was Queen of Connacht. And Maeve, who was Queen of Connacht, may have been some sort of supernatural figure before. It could be goddess, but again, I feel using the word god and goddess is a bit, it's misinterpreting. These are supernatural figures who interacted with humans and who changed. So at different times, they would have been almost a god, and other times not. But all these texts have a huge amount of stories that contain this. Like, it's kind of fascinating. Um, Growing up, I read book. I think Rosemary Sutcliffe had a novel about Fionn McHugh. She had another one about Cuchulainn. But when you start diving into it, there's so many texts, and there's different versions of stories, and different people appear in different ones. Um, for example, I don't think that Saint Bridget was a goddess. I don't. There may have been a Bridget, a goddess in parts of Britain and parts of France, but I don't think so in Ireland. On the other hand, there is a Bridget mentioned in one of the Cuchulainn stories. So it's a big swirl of stuff that you have to be very careful with. I like it that the fact that it's so confusing and so contradictory. I find that interesting, but that may just be me. It's nothing is clear cut, and just to kind of answer, were there druids? There were people who were like druids. We don't know exactly what they did. We don't know if they were all men or if they were men and women. I have a feeling that the latter could have been a possibility. Um, but I don't think they were centrally organized as such. According to Tacitus, the British Druids were trained as such in Anglesey, the island of Anglesey. I don't think there was an Irish equivalent of that. They were too decentralized. Now, if anyone wants to disagree with me, shout away. Shout away. Now, I wanted to jump far ahead to the famine. Saturday around at 4 p.m., I'll be bringing out a video on the famine discussing it. Could Philly or learned class be an echo of the previous religious class? Possibly. Or Christian priests could also be an echo of the previous religious class. I think you would find Philly poets and judges existing before Christianity. You would have also had some sort of clerical / religious figure. The Druids, as such, disappeared. They were replaced by priests in many ways. On the other hand, some people will argue, oh, the Druid was a poet and a judge and a magical person. And then they split into poets, judges, and then priests. But yeah, I think the main replacement of the Druid was the priest, the monk, the nun. Like if you take, for example, the stories about Bridget, the stories about Saint Fionnán, the stories about any popular saint, they're very magical. They copy magical stories about saints from non-Irish texts, like in popular Christianity, but there is a magical element in them. Um, like just going back to Saint Bridget, I know that there's her cloak. She puts her cloak on the ground, and expands dramatically. There's another story about her whereby one of her followers, a lady, was pregnant and she unpregnanted. I don't know if you can say that word. She unpregnanted this woman. Just the whole thing just disappeared. Um, and go to any saint, and like there are magical stories about them. So druids, I think druids as such continued as priests. Now, sorry, just one sec. As I said, just jumping to the famine. So Saturday, 4 o'clock, I'll be bringing out a video about the salmon, about understanding the salmon, and it's a video discussing what caused the famine. I don't give an answer because there's too many answers. Um, like some people say the famine was genocide. I was flicking through TikTok the other night and I saw a lady who's she's not Irish, but she's in Ireland saying it was no one in Ireland calls it a famine, which is not correct, saying it was enforced starvation. But that is too simplistic a figure, and I think the famine is too horrific, too central, too important an event. It's more than an event, too important a historical period in Irish history that you can answer it with simplistic pictures. Famine was directly caused by the blight. Um, but and at the same time, Ireland was producing food. It was exporting food throughout the famine. The food, especially the grain, the cereals that was exported, fell quite a bit. By the end of the famine, by the last 2 or 3 years, Ireland was a net importer of cereals. Most of what it was importing was maize, what we now call sweet corn. Um, but on the other hand, in 1840, 1841, between 40 and 50% of the population, the cottier class, essentially cottier and farm laborers, their diet was almost solely potatoes with a small bit of milk at times. Um, During the 19th century, the Irish population was shooting up. It was expanding in areas of bad agriculture, which is like upland areas, the Wicklow Mountains, and the west of Ireland. And in these areas, farms are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. They're all rented and sub-rented and sub-sub-rented. In the end, this cottier group, essentially what they had would have been like an acre or so on which they grew potatoes for themselves while they did labor for other people. Uh, they were lucky in that the potato was an abundant source of calories and other vitamins, etc. I think the one, I think vitamin K, or I could be wrong, was the one vitamin that you don't get from the potato. So it was a very healthy sort of food. But this huge amount of people, so 40% of the population, 40 to 50% of the population is almost 4 million. They did not have access in 1840 or 1830, 1845, before the famine. They did not have access to meat. They did not have access to any wheat grown in Ireland. They had very little access to barley. They had tiny amount of access to oats. And their access to milk, more specifically to butter, was getting smaller and was getting more and more and more reduced. So with the collapse of the potato crop, because the first blight was 1845, and then it keeps going for 7 years. So you have 7 years of bad harvests. So the essential food of half the population is gone. There's a disaster going to happen. Um, then things are made worse. Um, the traditional way of dealing with a famine, and there were famines probably every 30 years, would be soup kitchens, would be to provide what they would call it outdoor relief. So people could stay in their own homes, keep their own land, and get some sort of aid. And also, ports would have been the export of food would have been restricted. Um, at the beginning of the famine, okay, in the Great Famine, ports weren't closed, and I'll come back to that. But you have soup kitchens are set up, and in 1845, there's a lot of soup kitchens. Robert Peel is the Prime Minister of England. He brings in a lot of maize, so food is being brought in. Nobody dies in 1845, but what everyone expected to be a bad harvest for 1 year turns into a series of bad harvests. Um, the number of people on soup kitchens shoots up. The number of people doing they start building public works. So if you drive around the west coast of Ireland, you'll find roads in odd places. You'll see lots of small piers. Many of these were built by, you know, this people would they were just works. People would get paid to work in them. The problem with that is if you're hungry, if you're sick, you're going to be weak, and it's getting harder and harder for you to do this. And then the potato crop has disappeared. So the calorie source of a huge amount of population is gone. That means other food gets much more expensive. So people aren't able to buy food. And then even some of the smaller farmers who would traditionally have employed cottiers and laborers, they can't afford to take them on, and they're suffering themselves. So there's a series of things start happening, and then there's an election in England, and the Liberal Party win. In If you study Irish history and Leaving Cert, the Liberal Party in the 19th century generally comes across good because it's friendly towards Ireland in the second half of the 19th century under Parnell. But they make, think of some curse word, they make a complete and utter mess of what happens. First, for ideological reasons, and throw in second, there's this very strong moralism, and third, a strong dose of prejudice. So they believe in a free market and they believe in a free trade. So the market should be left to sort things out. Except the market is not working. It doesn't work in cases like this. When there's a term in economics about inelastic goods and which they don't really respond to the normal supply of demand, and food is like that. Food prices are shooting up. Um, the farmers who can produce food are selling it to make money, like they're selling grain and stuff like that. They're exporting it so they can buy other food. Um, I think there's a million people in 1846, 1847 surviving on soup kitchens and doing these building works. And then the new government shuts down the soup kitchens and says all aid is going through the workhouses. In 1838, the British government, they had in the 1820s, 1830s, they brought in a new poor law in England, which meant that you got any sort of aid from the government, you had to be institutionalized in the workhouse. Um, and they commissioned a report in Ireland, and the people went to Ireland and they came back and they said, no way, do not do this in Ireland. So this report got torn up and thrown away. They sent someone else to Ireland who wrote a report, And then the following year in 1838, they implemented the Poor Law. And Ireland is divided into poor law unions. Down here in Kerry, you had one in Carsavine, one in Kenmare, one in Killarney, eventually one in Dingle, one in Tralee, and I think there could have been one in Listowel. And each of these areas was responsible for the poverty in its own area. So to and they would build the workhouse, and the workhouse conditions in the workhouse were designed to be horrible. The idea was that it would be worse than the worst conditions outside. And then who paid for it but the people living in the area? So I'm in the Carsavine Poor Law Union. There would be a tax called a rate. So the people living here would have to pay that tax. Um, so, like, you had a rich area in London, they would not be helping me, even though it's the same kingdom, United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Uh, so it is a disaster set up. Then the crops collapse, but the potato crop collapses. They brought in the poor law system. The workhouse is designed to keep people away. Um, and then, like, the soup kitchens are abandoned. People have no option. It's now the third year in a row of the blight. People begin flocking to the workhouses. The workhouses get fuller and full, are completely full, and the people running them are expanding them as much as they can. And they're refusing to increase the rates. The government starts firing the people running the poor laws and the poor law unions and bringing in stricter ones. So it's a complete disaster. And then disease starts getting rampant because you've had people who haven't eaten properly in 3 years. So as well as hunger, there's typhoid, there's loads of diseases. People start dying. What would have been a serious problem, the loss of the main foodstuff of half the population, is turned by an ideology which is an anti-welfare ideology. It's the belief that the poor are poor because of their own misbehavior, because they spend all their money on drink, or they're lazy. So it blames the poor for being poor. Throw in this moralism and this anti-Irish prejudice. So it's a disaster. And it's a disaster of horrendous proportions. 1 million out of 8 million die because the famine itself goes on till about 1852. Another million leave. I think the population of Ireland, north and south now, I think is pushing 7 million. We're still below the population of 1841. I think it's the only country in Europe. Jess, you're asking about the potatoes. Yeah, there was the in the west of Ireland, the main potato used was the lumper potato. I think it produced more potatoes, but it was less good. Um, and it may have been a type that had been bred in Ireland, because if you come to Ireland now, you'll see Kerrs pinks, you'll see roosters. There's zillions of types. I've had friends, because I lived in South America for a long time. I had friends I studied with from Peru, and they have so many different types of potatoes we don't know over here. And most of their potatoes, I think, are grown like in the Andes. It's very high. It's used in a different area. Um, yeah, you're right. It was a monoculture, and the way they were generally planted was called in lazy beds, which there's nothing lazy about them. Essentially, you dug a trench, you put the potatoes. If you live near the coast and had access to seaweed, you used the seaweed as fertilizer, and then you just put the mud back. The following year, you dug a trench beside, and you, like, sort of, so you just went from one side to another side. And this is happening on land that's not good, land that's up the mountains, land that nowadays no farmer would plant anything on. It's used for sheep at the most, and sometimes grazing cows. Um, like in Bray Head, which is the other end of Valencia, which is quite high, you can still see these ridges caused by the growing of potatoes. The population of Valencia was over 1,000 in 1841, it's 600 now. So there was this utter dependence on it, but it wasn't, the famine itself wasn't deliberate. The government did stuff. It wasn't a modern government that it could organize very quickly proper famine relief. However, its ideology, its moralism, its anti-Irish prejudice meant that what would have been bad turned into something horrific. And I get an so I don't like people saying using the genocide word because it's a 20th century concept and it's applied backwards. It also means it was something deliberate. It wasn't deliberate, but that does not exempt the British government from blame. It's the whole thing is very, very, very complex. You have to be very nuanced about it. Um, and also the deaths, the people who died, most of them were poor. It was much more on the west coast of Ireland than in Dublin. Some landlords were good, others were bad. The there was an amendment passed, the Gregory Quarter, which meant, but it was passed. It was written by, I think, the father of the famous Lady Gregory. He was an MP, and it said that if you were going into the workhouse, if you had more than a quarter acre of land, you had to give that up. It was supposed to be something good. It turned into a horror. It meant that people lost their land, and even so, they were beating down the doors of the workhouses. Um, Dennis, you're asking, did some of the Irish farmers do well out of the famine? Not. I would turn that around a bit. Um, some large landlords took advantage of what was happening to get rid of their tenants. You also had a long-term move from the growing of grain to pasture, um, basically sheep and cattle, mainly cattle. That got speeded up by the famine because so many small farms got wiped out. A lot of the big farms were struggling because food costs had gone up so much. Um, they were finding it hard to buy like grain to plant, or they were actually, and also some of them were finding it hard to employ labor because they couldn't afford it or it wasn't available. Um, so it was. I remember years ago at the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein came out with this thing, the mother of all battles. The Great Famine was sort of the mother of all disasters. You have so much feeding into it, it just turns into a complete and utter horror. Um, that I think many people in Ireland are still coming to terms with. It's going to be, I think, in 20 years we're going to reach the pre-famine population. So it's going to be like almost 200 years to reach that, to get back to the 8 million. At the time of the famine, Ireland was 8 million. I think England was 10 or 12. There wasn't that big a difference. Now Ireland is, say, even if you include the north, it's say 7 million, whereas England is over 40. It's a big one. Cat by rooster. By purple. I think you mean the roosters. I think they're the purple ones. I like all potatoes. I like all potatoes. So yeah, I will talk more about that in my video. Just I think with the famine, you have to step back and look at. There's so much feeding into it. You can really only explain it by writing a book. And this sort of people screaming genocide and stuff like that, they misinterpret what's going on. They misinterpret what's going on. Now, something a bit more light for the next question. If anyone has another question, please feel free to shout. If you could witness one event from ancient, medieval, or even, okay, sorry, Jess, you're asking, are you aware of clear crossover parallels occurring between Irish pre-Christian Mat pantheon and the Welsh Brittonic Mabig. Yeah, I know what that word is. I just cannot pronounce it. Um, there is an art. He's I'm not. He's Dr. Gwillem something. I mentioned him on the last video I brought out about Samhain Halloween. He's in the notes to that. He deals with that question in great depth. And there are some parallels. He points out that like the word she, the Welsh borrowed that like almost 2,000 years ago. They borrowed the Gaelic word, but their other world, their she are slightly different. Whereas the Gaelic Irish one, each sort of mound is a separate kingdom, a separate other world. In Wales, they follow the Welsh structure, whereby there's a kind of a supreme leader, as such, a high king of this other world. Um, so he goes into details with that. Because there was in the post-Roman period, there were a few Irish attempts to settle in Wales, especially from Leinster, which is why I think you find Ogham stones and Ogham in in Wales. I think you're actually just mentioning that the Irish presence in South Wales, the Irish colonies. Yeah, so they brought stuff over, but there was also constant, ongoing trade, because Wales is very close to Leinster. It's no surprise that the Welsh, um, the Normans invasions, I think they came from Wales originally. Like Bristol, Wales, and Chester were the areas that are the ports that were closest to Ireland until the early modern period. Um, I think the majority of English soldiers in the 9 Years' War came from Chester, which is near enough to North Wales. So there would have been a cross fertilization of these ideas. They would have interacted with each other. Some might have gone back before Roman times, some ideas, and the Irish would have brought some over to Wales, and probably some Welsh stuff came in. But I think the mapping, or whatever that word is, which I can't pronounce, I think that's post Christian mainly. It's a bit like some of the Irish tales. But if have a look at my video on Samhain, and then have a look at that guy's stuff. He gives quite long videos talking about that in detail. I recommend his stuff. I find it quite good. Now, a lighter question. If you could witness one event from ancient or medieval Ireland, which would it? So ancient, medieval, or should we say early modern Ireland, up to 1800. Which event would you choose? So anyone want to volunteer? What would you love to go back and see in Irish history? I can think of about 500. I think if I could do that, I would be spend all day long going in a time machine back and forward. I would love to go and somehow see one of the big passage tombs, such as Newgrange, Nowtdout, or Fornox, when they were being used, just to see how they were used, and or even Tara at that stage. And I'm fairly sure I would be very surprised. Sort of, yeah. So because we have suppositions about how Newgrange was used. We know about alignments, etc., but we don't know about the ceremonies, that the rituals that took place in them. And I'm sure we'd be very surprised by them. And I'm fairly sure they must be very intricate ceremonies, because people went to great efforts to build these places, to align them, sometimes to put them on top of a mountain. The ones the ones in Newgrange now out along the Boyne Valley were put there for specific reasons. I think discovering that would be very interesting. A second time would be to see how Ireland became Gaelic, the first Gaelic people. I know that would take probably hundreds of years, but to discover how the Irish language emerged, as well as perhaps some of the stone circles or stone rows that I, many people are fascinating about it. Um, um, I would also like to be present at the Battle of Island Bridge. It's when Niall Glundov, from whom we get the name of Niall and Nine of sorry, from whom we get the name the O'Neills come from. He was killed in this big battle. He had been driving back the Vikings, the Norse, and had been doing it quite successful. Then you have this battle in which he and many other Irish kings are killed. We know very little about it, but I think it's very, very important. Um, I think I'd also like to be at the Battle of Kinsale, but I would try and change Irish history and try and prevent the Irish forces from marching, just getting them to stay in their places. Okay. Anyone else want to announce a time they would or an event they would like to see? I haven't. I've been to Newgrange a couple of times. I never been to Nout and Doubt, but I'm hoping the next year or two. Um, Sometime when I have a couple of days free, I think I'll just drive around Mead and Newgrange, Nout, Doubt, Tara, heading towards Sligo, visiting all um, these Neolithic places, and because they're fascinating. Um, the next question: could the 1798 rebellion ever have succeeded, or was it doomed from the start? Um, I think the rebellion in 1798 was doomed from the start. Yeah, Kat, you love the Neolithic sites. Good. I love them too, and we need to. There's so much more we can discover about them, and I'm fairly sure we will. So was the 1798 rebellion doomed from the start? If you count the start as 1798, I have a feeling yes. But if you start a bit earlier, no. I think I discussed last week the French fleet in 1796, which reached Bantry Bay but couldn't land. If that had landed those men, history would have been very different. Um, if Napoleon is supposed to have said when he was in Santa Helena that if he had gone to Ireland instead of Egypt in 1798, he wouldn't be in Santa Helena then. He said that to an Irish doctor, or at least the Irish doctor claimed he did. I don't know how true it is, but it is a possibility. There was a small French landing in Killala, in Mayo in 1798, which achieved great success. But I think there was only like 1,000 French troops. So if more had arrived, and it had arrived beforehand, because the rising Killala was after everything else was crushed, it could have done better. Also, you don't have a general rising in 1798. You have a series of risings that are more that are not very coordinated. So the you had United Irishmen were very strong, and then the government began to move against them, and they were quite successful in destroying the leadership. And then Wexford explodes. There's a rising in Leinster, in Wicklow, a couple of small risings in Ulster. I know there's a little one in Cork, and there's a few other scattered things. But the government, like the one in Wexford, is very successful. But it's defeated within a few weeks, a month, I think, or so at the most, at Vinegar Hill. If there had been a more coordinated rising, Britain would have been very, very stretched. And if the French had been quicker at sending men, if they paid more attention to Ireland and had been more alert to potential that was there, 1798 could have been successful. It was the French who ensured that the American Revolutionary War was successful. It was one of the few times in the 18th century where a French fleet beat an English fleet, but the French defeated an English fleet and somewhere near what's now the United States, meaning that the French fleet were then able to blockade the English under Cornwallis in Yorktown. Um, if something it's not beyond the bounds of possibility of something similar happening in Ireland. So 1798 could have been successful if the United Irishman leadership had moved faster, if the French had moved faster. There's a lot of things. Okay, a couple of you are putting forward ideas. Um, I would love to have seen the inauguration of a Gaelic chieftain. That's an interesting one, Bunyip. Were women present or was it an all male event? I have a feeling there were lots of women there because the traditional picture of inauguration was you had a crowd, often called drung. So if you ever come across a hill called Drung Hill, there's one there's one near Glenbeigh, and there's a few others around the country. Uh, it's a good possibility that hill could have been used for some sort of inauguration. Um, there was a ceremony. The ceremony as such only seems to have been performed by men, which was generally handing over the slot tiernas, the rod of lordship. But there would have been a crowd watching, and that crowd would have been both men and women. In some smaller lordships, there wasn't a ceremony. There's one there's one case in the book written about Hugh O'Donnell. Um, the guy writing said that there was some feast going on, some celebration, and Hugh O'Donnell gave a cup to someone and said, "You're now, I think, Maguire." But most of the time, there would have been some sort of ceremony, and I don't see women as being excluded from it. Like, if you go to the battles, there were women present at many, if not all, of the battles at that time. They didn't have this idea of excluding them. Jesse, I'd like to go and stay with an early Christian hermit, or since he'd tell me to go away in one of the very early, very remote rural monasteries you've documented. Yeah, there's a lot of them. And I have a feeling that I'm fairly sure I read that in one of them, because they find bones, there was a woman. It wasn't very, so there's a lot of around here. It's the very, very edge of Ireland, but there were so many monastic sites. It's kind of unbelievable. You kind of think in the 6th century, 5th century, did they do anything else in this part of Ireland apart from set up monastic sites? And there's some that I haven't documented because they're too hard to get to, or there's not much there, or it's all overgrown. So I'm feeling if you came down to Kerry in 600 AD, you could climb a mountain, dig up stone, and build a stone hut, and set up your own hermitage. And then probably someone else would come and annoy you and sit down and build other buildings beside you, and it may grow. And then 400 years later, or even before that, most of them disappear, and then they're replaced by parish churches and a small number of bigger monasteries. But that's a good one. Both of those were good. Both of those were good. Um, Now, what time is it? Okay, we have like 10 minutes left. So here's an interesting question: was Daniel O'Connell's approach of peaceful agitation, peaceful protest, more effective than revolutionary tactics? Hi Wayne and Jesse. I've considered advertising for a job as a hermit on some billionaire's estate. I have a feeling most billionaires don't like hermits. Unfortunately, Un- I wish they would. So Daniel O'Connell. Um, in some ways, in history, especially say Twitter or X history, his gradual and peaceful way of campaigning is not very popular, but it was very successful. Uh, and successful in ways that you don't think of at first sight. The campaign for Catholic emancipation could be seen as the first um, popular movement in Europe. So basically, the poor people who are excluded, who were excluded, began to protest. They got involved in this political movement. They paid, like, I think, a penny a month. They joined it. And ultimately, Catholic emancipation was successful. The British government is forced to let Catholics sit in Parliament for the first time in a couple hundred years. Yes, Kat, you did see my son appearing briefly, although my two kids are having dinner and they know I'm here, so I think they just forgot. So I saw him appearing in the background. Um, so Catholic emancipation was very successful. It forced the British to back down and allowed Catholics to sit there in Parliament for the first time in 200 years, maybe more than 200 years. And it's something that gets copied a lot. I know O'Connell had a big influence on the abolition movement in the United States. Um, Frederick Douglass was very impressed by it, and he met O'Connell in Dublin and was very impressed by him. Um, then comes the movement for repeal. That ultimately fails, in part because of the famine, in part because O'Connell is getting old, in part because O'Connell chickens out when he's ordered to call off the meeting in Clontarf. Um, Also, in part because his movement had split. The Young Ireland people had been pressing for a more, shall we say, revolutionary tactics. They were inspired by sort of revolutionary movements popping up elsewhere in Europe, and they went down a. They were wanting O'Connell to go along a path that was not very fruitful, and also while O'Connell was good at getting people elected as MPs, it was quite a while before the Irish Parliamentary Party would become effective. That only really comes in about 20 years or so after he dies that you have an effective parliamentary parliament with the rise of Parnell. Um, but nonetheless, O'Connell achieved a lot. Um, I know that gradualism or going slowly is not very popular quite often, but considering the failures of 1798, the failure of 1848, the failures of the Fenians, O'Connell did achieve much, and in a way, he taught the Irish people how to get involved in politics. So by the end of the 19th century, the Irish Parliamentary Party, it has a kind of popular movement behind it, and then in the 1910s, 1912, 1913, you have the rise of stronger nationalistic movements, and you have the Irish Volunteers, etc. Um, a lot of that you can follow back to Daniel O'Connell's success in showing people how to use politics. Um, And ultimately, you could also say that the fact that the Irish Free State survived as a democracy, unlike every other country that is created or reformed after World War One, like Hungary, the various Baltic states, the Balkan states, Germany, Poland. All of them become dictatorships in the 1920s, 1930s. The Free State government, for which had many faults, it followed a democratic path, and then you have the almost unknown occurrence of Cumann na Gael, who had fought and won a civil war, hand over power in 1932, 10 years after the Civil War, to the political successors of those who had lost it. You can say that to a large extent that is because of O'Connell. The Fenians, the Irish Revolutionary Brotherhood, um, they were set up by John Devoy. They were supposed to be a secret society. They were in a way, um, and they seem to have multiplied all across Ireland. There were many in the United States. A lot of them received training in the American Civil War, um, and some of them invaded Canada. I think 1867. There is an invasion of Canada led by Fenians, a Fenian army, in which they embarrass the government in Washington by winning the first battle, the Battle of Ridgeway, I'm fairly sure, which meant that the American government then kind of closed over the border and prevented more aid getting in. So the Fenians had to go back, had to return. Um, they were very successful, but then when it comes down to having a revolution, they messed up, they delayed. So by the time they attempt to do it, it's a complete and utter fiasco. I'll come back to that next week because the time is basically running out and there's too many details. But they had a very big influence culturally, because they get mentioned by loads of them. And in a way, the last Fenian, Tom Clark, is made president of the Irish Republic in 1916. Sort of, he was so Pierce and them were marking the importance of the Fenians. And the IRB itself existed until 1922 or 1923. Um, what's his name? Michael Collins was on the was an IRB guy, and I think he ended up controlling it. I'll come back to the Fenians next time. Vinny, interesting video on YouTube by Forgotten Weapons about the arms used by the Fenians in their invasion of Canada. That's an interesting. I must look up that one. Okay, Dennis, you'd like to be at the marriage of Strongbow and Aoife. Cashel. Yeah, that's an interesting one. And you could bring along a photo of there's a famous painting. I have a feeling the famous painting has got nothing to do with what happened. It would be very different. Okay, so it's basically 9 o'clock. I'm going to say goodbye then. So I will be bringing out a video on Saturday at 4 on, I was going to say the Fenians. It's not on the Fenians, it's on the famine at Saturday and 4. So if you want to watch that, it would be great. And then I'll come back. We'll have another live stream next Tuesday, hopefully at 7. And then at 9 o'clock, I will have the live stream with the two lads from Irish medieval history and the clans and dynasties. Wayne, have you read The Abstainer? I haven't. That's a nice tip. I'll have a look at that. So I've got two nice tips tonight. Feel free to give me books or videos to watch. I always like, especially books or articles. I always love having more to read. Not that I'll ever run out of reading, as you can see by the books behind me, but I always love having more books to read. Jesse, thanks for very interesting talks. Thanks for listening in, Jesse. Hope to see you again soon. So I will finish up then, and I will say good night to everyone, Slán, and see you soon. The mabbing, no, I can't pronounce it. There's some words I just can't pronounce. There's some words I can't pronounce. Thanks, Dennis. See you soon. Thanks, Kira. Thanks, Kat. Thanks, Wayne. So, Slán, Ihawa, good night.